Hey everyone, welcome back to GarageBand Guitarist, and this is the second lesson about the seventh chords. And I mentioned on the last lesson that there were three kinds of seventh chords that we're going to cover anyhow. The ones that just say a 7 after the letters, D7 or A7. The ones that say major seventh, Maj7, and then the minor seventh chord, so M7 or lowercase min7, okay? So we covered just the 7 ones, the dominant seventh chords in the last lesson, and this one we're going to go on to the major seventh chords. But before we do that, I really want to go back and do some more theory. Just learning those major seventh chords is very, very simple, and we'll do it right at the end of this lesson. But I want us to have our last theory lesson for the course here, which is going to help us understand all of this stuff about sevenths and why they're different, and help us with a couple more things we're going to do before the end of the course. So this lesson is primarily a theory lesson, okay? Now, when we get to the actual chords at the end of the lesson, they will also be in a PDF in the description of this video, so you want to download that before you get to that part of the lesson if you want, so you can have that in front of you. But it actually gives you the chord charts that I'm going to flash on the screen, but you'll have them there in front of you to practice and to work on as you're going through that part of the lesson. Okay? All right, let's start with the theory part though. Okay, let's go back to our intervals. We were talking about intervals in the last theory lesson. That was lesson 4. If you've forgotten that by now and you haven't looked at it in a while, you might want to go back and review that material. But I'm going to do a quick review right here just to level set and get us on the same page. Okay, so recall that we looked at a scale of notes, which is a sequence of notes, and a scale was defined by those notes having a particular series of half steps and whole steps in between them. And we talked about the major chord having, starting with the root note, whatever the note is you're starting on, then going up a whole step, and then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and then a half step gets you back to the same note you started on, an octave higher. Okay, that was the scale. And we numbered those notes in the scale. So the first root note was 1, and then the second one up a whole step was 2, and so on, all the way back up to the next octave. And we use those numbers to define intervals. And intervals are the distance between the chords. Okay, so going from the first note in the scale to the third one, we called that a third. And going up to the 5th note in the scale, we called that a 5th, and so on. And we use those intervals to define chords. And so at that point in time, we had only talked about major and minor chords, but in the major chord, it was the first, the root note, the 1, and the 3, the third note, and then the 5, the 5th note, the 1, 3, 5. Those 3 notes make up a major triad, okay? And again, this is all review. You've heard all this before, and I just wanted to remind you of it as we're heading into this part of the lesson. You also will remember that we had 2 versions of the third. Okay, we had the major third that we used in major chords, and then we had a note that was a half step lower than that we called the minor third. Okay, and that's what we use to make the minor chord. So depending on whether that third was the major third or the minor third, that defined whether it was a major chord or a minor chord. Those sadder sounding chords are the minor chords. Okay, all right. So in the case of E, I was just playing an E chord. The notes in the chord, in the major chord, are the first E, the third G sharp, and then the 5th B, right? But in the E minor chord, that middle note, that third, that G sharp has to go down a half step, and down a half step from a G sharp, of course, is a G. And so the 3 notes in the E minor triad are E, G, and B instead of E, G sharp, and B. okay? And that was the only difference between the major and minor chords, okay? All right, so that's where we left off on the last theory lesson, lesson number 4, okay? Now, in the lesson right before this one, when we were talking about the dominant 7th chord, we had this strange kind of thing where the 7th note, we were adding, so we had the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the major triad, and then we were adding another 4th note into that chord to make that 7th chord. And that note was the 7th, but it wasn't the 7th that was in the major scale. It was actually a half a step lower than the 7th that's in the scale. And so we talked about, in the case of C, for example, the note that's in the scale is a B. It's a half step before you get back to the top again, the B. There's nothing between a B and a C, so there's only a half step there. But that's not the note that you put in a dominant 7th chord. When it just says C7, you're not adding a B to the chord, to the C, E, and the G, the 1, the 3, and the 5. You're not adding a B, you're adding a B flat, a half step lower. And that's what gives you that dominant 7th chord and that dominant 7th sound, okay? So in this lesson, we're going to clear all that up a little bit by digging into our intervals a little bit more and kind of specifying in a little bit more detail what's actually going on with those intervals, okay? And that's going to help us understand these different 7th chords that we're going to talk about. But it's also going to help us understand that minor versus major chord distinction a little bit more and set us up for some other stuff that we're going to do before we're done with the course, okay? All right, so that's what we're all about in this lesson, is to get a little bit more serious about the intervals, okay? All right, now let's go back to our C major scale for a second, okay? And I'll put this back up. Remember, we've had this before, and we've got the letters in the C scale, and I picked C on purpose because it happens to be the only one where there's no sharps or flats in the scale, in the major scale. So it's just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, back to C, right? That's the scale here, okay, from low to high. And then we numbered those, again, repeating what we've done before. So the lowest C is a 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is the repeater, and we called that the octave, okay? So number 8 is the octave, right? That corresponds to what you know, I'm sure, is the do, re, mi scale. So if we were starting on C, let me just start on this same note for fun, okay? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay? You know that scale. It's in the Sound of Music song, and you hear it all the time. If you ever played in a band or choir, you sang it when you warmed up, okay? So you know that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scale, and it corresponds to these numbers. And in the case of C, if you're starting on C, it corresponds to these letters, okay? And I also have down here that root, and then you go up a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step pattern to get those notes. That's what's in between each of those notes. There's always a whole step between them, except E to F. There's not an extra note in there. There's only a half step, and B to C. Okay? Again, reviewing things that we've already covered a couple of times, but just want to make sure that you have that back in your head. Okay? Okay, but when you look at this set of notes here, we know that there's additional notes in between some of them. The ones where there's a whole step between C and D, that's a whole step, so there's another note in between there. That C sharp or D flat is in there. So let me just change the layout here a little bit to make this a little bit more clear. So let me put it up like this, and what I've done here is I've put a space in where there's another note in there so we can see where those other notes go. So between C and D, there's a bigger space because there's another note in there. Between D and E, there's a bigger space because there's another note in there. But between E and F, there's not another note. So I left those ones closer together, okay? And this gives you a kind of a better visual layout of how these notes in the major scale are related to one another, all right? Now, let's just also put in those extra notes for reference. And I'll put them on a separate line here so we can kind of keep track of them in a different way. But as we're going up half steps, we'd go C to C sharp, to D sharp, to E to F sharp, so on, all the way up, okay? So those are all half steps going along on this scale, all right? But I've aligned them like this to help us understand what's going on. If you know the piano, you'll recognize that the letters that don't have sharps on them are the white keys on the piano, and the ones that are on the higher line here, the C sharp and D sharp, all the sharps, those are the black keys on the piano. And that's another reason why I laid it out like this, because that corresponds to the piano for those of you who are used to the piano, okay? All right, all right. Remember that those extra notes up there, those 5 extra notes that are sharps, they also have another name. There's 2 possible names you could call them, okay? They could either be called C sharp, meaning above the note that's below it, so the C, or D flat on that first one, right? We could call that either C sharp or D flat. Same thing with all of them. They have 2 possible names. It's the same thing. It's the same sound. It's the same note. It's just it's called something different depending on other things in the context of the music. We're not going to get into that in this course, but just remember that they can have 1 of 2 names, okay? But for the sake of this lesson and making it easier to see and understand and follow, I'm just going to use the sharp name. So let's go back to this one, okay, where we have the C's, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, okay? And now we're going to fill in some additional information on this little chart so you understand what's going on, all right? All right, so first thing, let's put our numbers back in there, all right? So put our 1 on C and 2 on D and 3, 4, and so on going up, okay? And those, again, indicate intervals. So from C to E, that's a third, right? Because we go from 1 to 3, that's a third. From C to G, that's a fifth, right? So from 1 to 5, that's a fifth, okay? Same thing with all of them, right? So that number tells us how big the interval is, how much space there is between those notes. That's what the interval is, okay? Now, it's more specific than this, though. We have to account for those notes in between the ones we've already labeled with numbers, okay? So C to E is a third, okay, great. But what about D sharp, the one that's right below E, that's between D and E? What's that? What do we call that, okay? And that's what I want to talk about next here, okay? So let's start with the first one there, the C sharp. So we start at C, and the next note up is C sharp. Okay, what do we call that? We know C is 1, and we also call that unison. So if you were playing 2 of those, two C's, it'd be the same thing, it'd be unison, right? So we call that unison. We know D is a second, okay? But it turns out that there's 2 versions of the second. There's 2 versions of the second. Here it is on this chart, okay? And so, and the major second is one of them, and the minor second is the other one, all right? And the major second is, no surprise, it's the one that's in the major scale. And so in the case of starting on C, the note that's in the scale is 1 step up, it's D, all right? That's the note that's in the major scale, and so we call that interval from C to D, we call that the major second. And we indicate that with a capital M for major, okay? Major second. So now we know that there's not just a second. That was too imprecise, okay? We know there's a major second, which is a whole step, and we know that there's a minor second, which is just a half step from C to C sharp in this case, okay? That's pretty straightforward, okay? We just got to remember that for the second, there's 2 of them. All right, and one's a little bigger, it's called a major one, it's in the major scale. There's a minor one that's right below it, half step below it, all right? And this turns out to be the same thing for most, not all, but most of the other intervals, okay? So let me put up the whole run here, and you can see that there is a major and a minor version of the third, which we have talked about in the context of the major and minor chords, right? But this just kind of lays it out a little bit more clearly, so you can see that the note E is the major third, and that's the one that's in the major scale, right? And so that E is called the major third, and the one right below it, the D sharp or E flat, same thing, right? D sharp or E flat, that's the minor third, right? And that's the note we change to when we switch the chord into being a minor chord, all right? Same thing with the sixth, okay? So from C to A is a major sixth. A is in the major scale, all right? So that's the major sixth, and the 1/2 step below that gets to be the minor sixth, okay? The G sharp or A flat, all right? Same thing with the seventh. So the major seventh is B. That's the major seventh. That's in the scale, so it gets to be the major seventh. And then A sharp or B flat is the minor seventh, right? So that's what that interval is called, from C up to B flat or to A sharp is called the minor seventh, all right? All right, and that minor seventh interval is what produces the dominant seventh chord, all right? And that should make sense to you now based on my explanation of it in the prior lesson. It's 1/2 step down from the note that's in the scale, the B. So it's a B flat is that minor seventh interval, which is also 1 whole step down from the root note, from the octave of the root note, right? From the C. It's 1 full step down, 1 whole step. And so that's how we find that note, the minor seventh, is 1 whole step down from the root note. So if you're in C, it's B flat. If you're in D, it's C, a whole step down from D, okay? And so on, all right? All right, so that produces the dominant seventh chord that we learned in the last lesson. All those dominant seventh chords had this character of having the minor seventh interval note in the chord, added to the triad on top of it, okay? Now the major seventh interval, the one that is in the scale, and in the case of C, that's the B note, that's what we use to make the major seventh chord, which is the topic of this lesson, all right? And we're going to get to those in just a second, but I'm not quite done with my chart yet. You notice there's 3 in the middle here that I left blank. I put little blanks in there. These 3 intervals are special. They're interesting in different ways, and they have interesting characteristics, and they do a lot of work, very special work in music. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff about them. Now, we're not going to go into all of that in this. We don't have time to do all of it, but it leads us to having special names for those intervals, okay? And we kind of have different approaches to handling them and the notes right around them than we did with these minor sixth and major sixth and minor seventh and major seventh, okay? So it's different, all right? Now, it probably will seem a little arbitrary to you, but it's just another one of those things that you got to accept in music, okay? These notes are, these intervals are particularly important in the kind of music that we're doing too, and we'll talk about that more by the time we get to the end of the course, okay? So we're talking here about the 4th and the 5th, and then the note that's in between the 4th and the 5th, all right? Now, for the 4th and the 5th, they're not called major or minor. They're called perfect. So you have a perfect 4th and a perfect 5th. Okay, let me put the chart up here. And you can see I put a P by the 4 and the 5. So it's a perfect 4th and a perfect 5th. All right, now there's interesting reasons why they're called perfect intervals. And one of them is that they're complementary to one another. Okay, so the 4th and the 5th have a special relationship with each other. If you flip one of them upside down, more or less, you get the other one. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about this in the key of C here, okay? So in the key of C, C to F is a 4th, right? C to F, going up is a fourth. But if I keep going up to the next C from the F to C is a fifth, right? So C to F is a fourth, F to C is a fifth. C to the next F is a fourth, F to the next C is a fifth, right? And so they have that complementary nature. It's the same thing with the fifth, all right? If I go from C to G, that's a fifth. C to G is a fifth. And then from G up to the next C is a fourth. Okay? And so they have that special kind of relationship, and it allows you to flip them around in various ways when you're playing music and playing the guitar to produce interesting effects with what you're playing. Okay? And so those are very, very important. Now they're important in other ways too, which we will get to later, but that's one of the reasons why they're called perfect intervals because of that complementarity that they have. Okay? On your guitar, your strings are all a fourth apart, right? E to A, when you tune E to A, that's a fourth. A to D, that's a fourth. D to G, that's a fourth. Uh-oh, but then there's one exception. I said all the strings, but it's all except one, all right? Always we have that issue between G and B. That's not a fourth, okay? That's only a third. That's a major third. G to B. But then we're back. B to E is a fourth again, okay? Right? And that's something to appreciate about how your guitar is tuned, because it's tuned in fourths with the exception of that G to B. Those strings, the distance between those strings is less, okay? Now, a lot of times people don't, in fact, almost all the time, people don't say perfect every time they talk about a fourth or fifth interval. They just say fourth or fifth, okay? But technically, they are perfect fourths and perfect fifths, okay? So when you hear that, you'll know what people are talking about, all right? All right, we still got one left, though. We still haven't filled in that blank that's in between the fourth and the fifth, right? That's right in the middle of the scale, all right? So in this key of C, it's the F sharp. So C to F sharp. Okay, what is that? What do we call that interval? It's between the fourth and the fifth. And it has a really funky sound to it. And you might think maybe it's called a minor fifth because it's one half step below the fifth. No, it is not. It is not called a minor fifth. It is actually called, most of the time people call it the flatted fifth. Okay, so it's a fifth down a half step, so flatted fifth. All right, and you see that little notation down there. It's also called the augmented fourth. The augmented fourth. So going up from the four up, it's augmented. It's bigger. Taking a fourth and making it bigger, so it's augmented. Okay, and so that's the other name you sometimes hear. Most of the time, people call it a flatted fifth. Okay, but here's a fun one. I'm sorry, I forgot to say it's also called the tritone. All right, so when you hear people calling something a tritone, oh, there's a tritone, or they should put a tritone in there. That's what they mean. Is they mean that interval from the root note to that space in between the fourth and the fifth. Okay, it's 6 half steps. That's what it is, right? And it's got a funky sound. It sounds like this. This is a tritone. Okay, it's pretty dissonant, and it's a unusual tone to a lot of people's ears. Doesn't sound pleasant. And back in the olden days, it was perceived as not just being dissonant, but actually being evil. And so it is also called, because of that, it is called the devil's interval. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, it's very evil sound, I guess. And so, so you can kind of hear, that might seem spooky to you if all you ever listen to in your life is major chords, and all of a sudden somebody comes at you with, you're like, your guitar's not tuned properly or something, what are you playing? You're playing the wrong note. Okay, But people actually perceive that as being evil. You will not find the devil's interval in a lot of church music from back in the olden days because of that. Okay? All right. So that's it. Now we've learned all of the intervals. Okay? And you can do this thing with any scale. Okay? So you start with your, let's do G. Okay? Here's G laid out here. You start with G and you fill in the notes that are the major intervals that are in the G major scale. And so in a G major scale, you've got G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. Okay, we're back to G. Okay, that's the major one. So G to A is a major second. G to B is a major third. G to C is a perfect fourth. G to D is a perfect fifth. G to E is a major sixth. G to F sharp is a major seventh. And G to G is the octave. Okay. The other ones are the minors. So G to G sharp is a minor second. G to A sharp is a minor third. G to C sharp is a flatted fifth or a devil's interval. G to D sharp is a minor sixth. And G to F is a minor seventh. And that's the note. The minor seventh is the one that we put in last time to form our G dominant 7 chord, G7. Okay. All right. Let's do one more just for yucks. It starts on totally different notes. So you get a sense of this. B flat. Let's do B flat. Okay. So B flat's the root note. Go up a step and we're at C. That's the major second. Go up another step. We're at D, major third. Go up a half step. We're E flat. That's the perfect fourth. We go up another step. We're at F, the perfect fifth. Then we go up another step. We're at G, the major sixth. Another step. We're at A, the major seventh. And then back to B flat for the octave. And then the same thing with the minor intervals going up. B to B flat's a minor second. B to D flat is a minor third, and so on the rest of the way up the scale. And you can do that with start on any note and fill that in just to kind of get yourself used to thinking about the intervals that way. Okay? All right. Now, the point of doing all this for this particular lesson, even though it's going to help us with some other stuff too, the point of doing it for this lesson was so that we could understand the difference between the dominant seventh and the major seventh chord. So the D7 and the D major seventh, or the A seventh and the A major seventh, right? That's where we've been driving at with this whole thing. And so going back to our C for a second, let's put this chart back up here. And we've already talked about this. Let's just say it again to put it right in the front of our minds as we go into how to form these chords, okay? So if we go C to A sharp, we're going up a minor seventh. And that's going to give us the dominant seventh chord, right? Because we're using the minor seventh interval, all right, in that chord. All right? If we want a major seventh chord, though, we got to go up to the one that's in the scale. And in this case, that's B. That's the major seventh. So we got to have the major seventh interval in our chord. Now, in both cases, we're adding a note to our original major triad of 1, 3, 5. In this case, C, E, and G. We're going to add a note to that. If we add the minor seventh, we're going to get the C7 or the C dominant 7 chord. Okay? If we add the major seventh to those three, to that triad, 1, 3, 5, major seventh, then we're going to get the C major seventh chord, right? And that's how those are constructed, all right? So to form a major seventh chord, which is what we want to do here in the rest of the lesson, is learn some major seventh chords. The note that we're adding, that major seventh, is always 1/2 step lower than the root note. Fairly straightforward. In the case of C, it's B. In the case of G, it's a 1/2 step down from G, it's F sharp. In the case of A, it's 1/2 step down from A, the A flat or the G sharp, okay? That's the note we have to add in order to make a major 7th chord. So it's pretty easy to figure out most of the time. As long as you know where your root notes are, you just got to get one of them down a half step and you've got yourself a major 7th chord. All right? Let's do it with C. Let's make an actual chord on your guitar, okay? Oh, and I just wanted to say at this point, so you don't get confused, there are kind of 3 ways this gets indicated in a piece of music, okay? Usually, most likely, it'll say C, and then lowercase M-A-J, and then a 7, okay? That's the one I'll use. That's the most common. Sometimes it says C with a capital M and a lowercase a-j and a 7, okay? Means exactly the same thing, just 2 different abbreviations for the same thing. And then sometimes, and this is less likely, they'll put a C and a capital M and a 7, okay? And that capital M means it's a major 7th chord, okay? They all are telling you the exact same thing, tell you to do the exact same thing. But those are just 3 different things you see, and I want to make sure you realize they're the same thing and that you're not supposed to do something different because there's capital letters or something in there, okay? All right, so let's make this C major 7th chord on your guitar, all right? And all we got to do is think about this real quick. You'll recall your old friend, C, okay? And we've got to get a B in here somehow, right? 1/2 step below C. Well, there's a real easy way to do that. Here's the chord chart, and because you're playing a C on the B string up here, all you got to do is let that be open and it's a B. And now you've got your C major 7th chord. Okay? Very simple to play, especially if you can already play a C. You just lift up your index finger, you're done. You got it. I like those chords. I like the way they sound. They seem a little sad and mysterious, melancholy. I like those chords. Okay, so that's a C major 7th chord. Easy enough. Okay, let's do F major 7th. F major 7th. And the way we're playing an F chord is we're playing an E form bar chord, right? That's how we get to an F. What's the note we need to add? It's 1/2 step down from F, which is E. So we got to get an E in here somehow, all right? Well, we're playing a couple different Fs here, so we've got a lot of choices. For example, we've got an F we're playing here on our highest string, and we're on the 1st fret. And we've got the same thing down here on our lowest string. We're playing Fs there. So if we let one of them up and let it open, we will have a E, right? Because that's the note we're tuned to. So that's how we can get the Fs in here. But when you're doing that, when you're lifted, you're not using your bar anymore, basically. And so you got to shift your hand around just a little bit. And what we do to get this high E open is we change our fingers. So we have a 1, 2, 3 going down here. And index finger, middle finger, ring finger. Okay. And we can leave. We can make a choice here. We could continue to play this C if we wanted to, but we don't have to because A, an open A, that's also in an F chord, right? That's the 3rd in the F, right? So, so we can just play it like this chord chart right here, and you can hear how that kind of has the same character as the C one. When I'm playing that F major 7th chord, you can see I got that lowest string X'd out, not to mute it or not play it, okay? And you can play it though, it's an E, right? And that's the note we're adding in, that's the major 7th note. Same one we're adding up here, just lower, right? But people usually don't do that. The reason is because when you're playing these more dissonant kinds of notes sometimes, if you play them too low, it makes the guitar and everything sound kind of muddy, right? It just doesn't sound as good. I'm playing the same note down there, but but it doesn't sound right, all right? And the reason for that is a technical thing that has to do with how the strings vibrate in harmonics and things. We're not going to get into all of that technical detail. Just remember that when you're adding these notes in, it usually works better if they're up higher on your strings than down low like that. And sometimes you want to block them or not play them on the lower strings, okay, when you're putting that extra dissonant note in there. So usually when people play the F1, they block that string and just start with the A string. Okay. The F major 7th and the C major 7th chord also happen to go together really nicely, okay? So, you know, you play the F and the C. Here's the F. C, F. And so you'll hear those together a lot sometimes in songs, okay? If you have one, you may have the other in the song because they work really nicely together like that. Okay? All right, that's C major 7th and F major 7th. Let's do 3 others that you see pretty commonly. They're pretty easy. D major 7th, A major 7th, and G major 7th. Okay? Let's do the D one first. This is our D major chord. We got a little triangle here. And the note we need to add is a C sharp or a D flat, right? And we want it up kind of high, like I was saying, and there's a D right here. We're playing a D on the 3rd fret of the B string. And so we just need to drop that down a half step. And it gives us this little kind of mini bar right here, 3 across, like that. You can hear how it has the same character as those other major 7th chords. Easy to play. Play with your first finger or your second finger, whatever. All right, D major 7th chord. Get that C sharp in the middle. A major 7th. When we're playing an A chord, we've got that 3 notes that we're fretting on the 2nd fret, right? And we got to get A flat or a G sharp in there. Where can we get that? Well, that middle note in that little line of 3 is an A. We're playing an A on the G string. So we just need to get that down a half step to G sharp, right? Or to A flat, right? And that's just that same little triangle formation that we've been using elsewhere. We used it on the B7 chord, we used it on the D7 chord, and now we're just using it here, and it's going to give us the A major 7th. Okay? The relationship between that A major 7th and the D major 7th is relatively the same as the C one and the F one, so you tend to have those together too. All right, last one that we're going to cover in this lesson is G major 7th. G major 7th, okay. So what note do we need to get for G major 7th? What note do we need to add to our triad? Well, to our major triad, we need to add a F sharp, right? 1/2 step down from G, F sharp, F sharp. All right, and where can we get that? Well, with our regular old G chord, we're playing a G note up here on our high E string on the 3rd fret. So we just got to get that down 1/2 step to that note, and we'll have a G major 7th chord. Now you could do that by kind of twisting your hand and getting your ring finger down there, but that's kind of hard, uncomfortable. People don't usually do that. Instead, you kind of flip over to something that's closer to what you were doing when you were playing your G7 chord. When we had it set up like this and we were playing that F note on the first string of our E, or first fret of our E string, okay? And we're just going to move that up 1 fret, okay? So just a little twist there. So you're still playing the G note on the low E string, B note on the A string on the 2nd fret, 3 open strings, D, G, B, and then we've got our F sharp. We're playing with our index finger on the 2nd fret up here, and it gives us that G major 7th sound. Okay, that's it. We finished the dominant 7th chords and the major 7th chords. Now, I didn't do all of the major 7th chords, and my reasoning for that is that people hardly ever use them. You know, they could. You could be playing a different key and need a major 7th chord, but people just don't do that for whatever reason. And again, I've said this before, but my goal in this course is to give you what you need to play in a garage band, not load you down with all kinds of stuff that I suppose it's nice to know, and maybe someday it'll be something you want to know, but you don't really need it at this point. And so I'm not going to add extra stuff in there that you're not really going to use. Okay, so I'm skipping like the E major 7th chord, and what else did I skip? I skipped B major 7th chord. Okay, you know, you just don't use them very often. I mean, I can hardly think of a song that has one of those chords in it. All right, so I'm just going to pass by them. Okay, if you really want to figure them out, though, you can do it. I told you how. Figure out what note you need to add. Go down here and see what note you're playing, and find out where you can add the note that you need, and move your fingers around to try to accomplish that. Okay, but I'm not going to go into that because I don't think anybody's going to ask you to play those chords. All right, that's it for these major 7th chords. We got one more chunk of 7th chords left for the next lesson, the minor 7th chords, and they're a different cat altogether. Okay, it's just not the same kind of logic at all as to why they're called what they are, and so I'll explain that in the next lesson, but I just want to make sure you understand that they're different from these chords we've been talking about so far that are 7th chords. Okay, so tune in next time for the minor 7th chords.